Hello, I'm clinical nutritionist Megan Pfeffer, and in today's session we're going to be looking at overcoming cravings and emotional eating. So we'll consider if cravings are physiological or emotional. We'll also look at dopamine and dopamine deficiency. We'll look at how processed foods affect the brain. We'll talk about feeding the unmet need, also about making changes and tips for overcoming cravings. So firstly, I think it's important to know that if you struggle with cravings and emotional eating, there is nothing wrong with you. We tend to, in the sense that we tend to self-blame, feeling like we're lacking willpower. People are telling us not to eat so much and that we should just stop, eating certain foods, but it's just not that simple. That really is oversimplifying a very complex issue. Your body and mind aren't working against you. They're just trying to make you feel better. So we have our conscious and subconscious mind, and we'll be talking more about this. But the subconscious mind, that deeper down critter mind that we talk about, that really just is out to protect us and keep us safe, that is, it will use whatever methods it knows can help to make you feel safe. And so that self-soothing, self-medication type thing can very easily come from foods. And of course, foods are just so readily available that it's something that a lot of people have turned to, and it has become an ingrained habit. But there's also a lot of underlying reasons why that has happened too, which we're going to have a look at. So your challenges with food really can teach you a lot about what is going on with your behaviors and habits, and what is actually driving those, if you're willing to look at a little bit deeper. So cravings can be due to something physical, like a condition or a deficiency. So first, let's talk about dopamine and the dopamine-mediated food reward in the brain. There's controversy over whether this is about food addiction or whether perhaps it's an eating addiction. But either way, what is dopamine and a dopamine deficiency? So dopamine is a neurotransmitter and it's a hormone. So it's a signaling molecule, and it communicates chemical messages between nerve cells in your brain, or between your brain and the rest of the body. So it plays a really important role in many of your body's functions, including memory, motivation, learning, and the reward center, and also movement. So dopamine deficiency means having a low level of dopamine, which is linked with certain health conditions like Parkinson's disease or depression. It's also linked with ADHD, and that's becoming a more common disorder amongst women and amongst aging women. So I'm starting to see a lot more women in their 40s, 50s, 60s that are being diagnosed with ADHD. So this doesn't mean that you have ADHD, but it does mean to keep in mind of the symptoms. And if you feel like you can relate to many of them, then it might be something to discuss with your health provider, with your doctor. Can also make you susceptible to developing addictions. And so low dopamine causes can happen in select areas of your brain where dopamine is produced. So you could have low levels if there's an injury to areas of the brain that make dopamine, and this can be from things like neuroinflammation, so inflammation in the brain, and oxidative stress. And we know that there's lots of things that can cause that, and we'll look at those in a moment. But certainly diets that have a lot of junk food, or binge eating junk food can cause damage to certain areas of the brain by inflammation and oxidative stress. You could also have a low level of dopamine if your body doesn't properly respond to dopamine, if there's an issue with the nerve cell receptors, but also certain health conditions, as we spoke about before, such as ADHD, and low dopamine can make you more susceptible to things like food addiction. So the theory of how this works is that the overuse and overexposure to stimulation, such as food, high palatable food, bombard the dopamine receptors in the brain, causing them to downregulate or close. So initially, it will actually upregulate those receptors in the brain. So when we first start eating those hyperpalatable foods, the brain lights up and we will upregulate those receptors in the brain. And so, we can get more and more pleasure from eating them. But over time, it actually has the opposite effect, where it will actually start down regulating those receptors. And so you do need much more of it to get the same feeling, if you can get that same high feeling that you could in the first place. And so a lot of people, with binge eating, I think this can really lead into that as well, that whereas before you may have been able to get that high from foods, or that sense of pleasure from a certain amount of foods, you may need a whole lot more to be getting the same effect. And I think that can be comforting to some people to know that there is a reason why, why sometimes with binge eating there can be getting more and more foods there that people just understanding, because intellectually they know they shouldn't be eating it. They're trying to stop themselves. They don't want to be eating these foods. But of course, there's something going on a much deeper level, and this can really help to explain that. So symptoms of dopamine deficiency can be things like a complete lack of motivation, finding it really hard to find the drive to do anything. You're also just feeling really tired, quite often feeling moody and anxious, finding it difficult to concentrate. You don't feel pleasure from things that you used to enjoy. There can be depression and feelings of hopelessness, a low sex drive or low libido, and trouble sleeping and a disturbed sleep. Now, a lot of those things can be attributable to other things as well, which is why it's really important not to self-diagnose here. The key is to identify those things and speak to your doctor and let them know what you're experiencing, and they can help you put the pieces together. Or other health professionals as well, not just doctors. So low dopamine, other symptoms of low dopamine levels include hand tremors or other tremors at rest, loss of balance or coordination, increased muscle or limb stiffness and muscle cramps, restless leg syndrome, which I know a lot of women with lipedema can suffer from. And this is not to say, again, that restless leg syndrome can be attributable to other things, but it means that if you haven't been able to find the reason for that, and you're associating, lots of these symptoms, that perhaps this is something else to explore. But also the thing I should point out too is that you really want pathology discounted. So you want to make sure that there is no disease process in place that's attributing to these things. And then that sort of enables you to explore some natural remedies involving food and lifestyle that you can do to help to see if that can improve some of these things. So yeah, other things, problems with anger, low self-esteem, those types of symptoms, social withdrawal, reduced emotions, not feeling pleasure, and gastrointestinal symptoms, including things like chronic constipation. So how can you increase dopamine levels? Well, if you think you have a low dopamine levels, as I said, do speak to your healthcare provider, because if you do have a condition that's going on, say that it is depression, for example, then it may be treatable with medications that can help to raise serotonin and dopamine that can make you feel a lot better. So that's something to take into account also I think with your natural health practitioner. It's important to work out what may be going on there, because, sometimes, even our gut health can really impact things like depression. So we need to work out whether it could be attributable to a poor diet and perhaps a poor microbiome, or whether it is something that needs to be addressed through medication. If it can't be attributable to a condition, then we can look at things like food, supplements, and lifestyle. So that includes doing things like that include magnesium-rich and tyrosine-rich foods. Tyrosine is an essential amino acid, and magnesium is a mineral that we can obtain through our diet and can aid in the production of dopamine. So foods or low-carb foods that are known to increase dopamine include things like chicken, almonds, apples, but of course low carb, or if you're keto, you would need to make sure it's a very small, not overly sweet apple, or you may just need to start with very small amounts. Have a quarter of an apple, for example, if you're first starting, or if you're have high blood sugar levels like type 2 diabetes. Avocados, beets, again, is an underground vegetable, something that we like to limit because it can be very high in sugars, but in small amounts can be nice. Grated on a salad, for example, can be lovely. Cacao, which can be found in dark chocolates, preferably ones that don't contain much sugar. And so if you're keto, that really needs to be 90% cacao or higher. Green leafy vegetables, although nowadays we find with modern farming practices that green leafy vegetables don't tend to obtain magnesium in the levels that they used to. And so I really feel with magnesium, it's something that we do tend to supplement. So that's something to consider. And we do look at supplements in another section of the course specifically for supplements for women with lipedema and lymphedema. And you can see there's a few other things there that are associated with helping to increase dopamine production. Other things to make sure that you're doing is engaging activities that make you feel happy or relaxed, because that can help with dopamine release. So some examples include things like exercise or movement, meditation, yoga, massage, playing with pets, those types of things. And as I mentioned, in the 8-week online Keto for Lipedema and Lymphedema course, we have a session on supplements that we go into more detail about what are the supplements that can also help to ensure that we're getting good dopamine production. So let's look now at processed foods and how they affect the brain, because for some people, emotional eating and binge eating can tend to include a lot of processed and refined carbohydrate foods. So the brain has this reward center, dopamine-based reward center that we talked about, that hardwires us to want to engage in behaviors that we find pleasurable. So that is hardwired into our brain, and eating tasty foods is one of those pleasurable activities that we are hardwired to do. And food manufacturers know this and take full advantage of it. So when we eat junk foods that reward circuits within our brains, activate and release the hormone dopamine. And it's not just junk foods. That's why I really call it processed foods, because people will picture junk foods as being, hot chips and takeaway burgers and fries and those sorts of foods. It's not just those types of obvious junk foods. It's processed foods that use sub-quality ingredients, that combine a lot of poor quality fats and salt, those types of foods. So most packaged foods that are ultra refined fall into that category. So our brains can become overwhelmed by the pleasure from these rewarding foods. And initially, as I mentioned earlier, it can upregulate receptors for dopamine, which can feel great. But over time, the receptors become fewer or don't work as well. And so you need to eat more and more to get the same response, similarly to that of tolerance to drugs. So also processed food can make us impulsive. So we rapidly learn that these fatty, sugary junk foods or processed foods are delicious, and it gets our attention whenever we see them. So to resist that temptation, we need the major control center in the brain, which is called the prefrontal cortex. And this area doesn't even mature until our early 20s. And that's one reason why teenagers can sometimes act really impulsively, not only around food, but dangerous behavior as well. So recent research has also shown that consuming lots of these types of foods when you're young could actually alter brain development and affect us in adulthood. So processed foods can also inflame your brain, as I mentioned earlier, that neuroinflammation. So processed food is highly refined and contains very high levels of sugars and fats. Now, remember, by sugars, a lot of people say, but Megan, I don't eat a lot of sugar. And that could well be the case. But remembering that all carbohydrates break down to sugars. So it's not just the obvious sugars and things that contain sugar. It's also things like bread or pasta or crackers or any of those, what we call the savory sugars. They all break down to sugar, whether it's a complex carbohydrate or a simple one like sugar or chocolate or lollies, or it's sweet potato and those types of complex ones. They all still break down to sugar, and that's a really important thing to understand. So in the same way that eating food you're allergic to can inflame your mouth, for example, junk foods can cause a similar reaction in the brain. So that's the neuroinflammation, and it sets off this self-perpetuating series of events that leads to more inflammation that can damage the brain cells, which are called neurons. And so Australian researchers recently showed that as little as 5 days on a diet of sugary drinks, cakes and cookies, for example, but that could also, include crackers and those types of savory ones that can also still be really high in sugar, cause increased levels of inflammation in the hippocampus in the brain. So people with damage to that part of the brain report being hungry all the time. So it damages hormones and things that are involved in appetite regulation. So another thing to realize is that our experiences are stored as memories, and these are formed in the brain through connections between neurons, which are constantly being recognized in response to the environment that we live within. So this process is described as neuroplasticity, the ability to shape the brain in response to our environments. So diets containing a lot of processed foods have been shown to reduce neuroplasticity, which is essential for us to form new memories and learn new things rapidly. So, periods of binge eating, it's so important to get that under control, because even short amount of times can be damaging our brains. Another reason why we love processed foods, junk food reduces the generation of new neurons. So the birth of these new neurons, which is called neurogenesis, happens throughout life in that part of the brain, the hippocampus that we already mentioned. And these new neurons have high levels of the neuroplasticity that we were talking about, meaning they're very easily activated by environmental events and are essential for forming new memories. And so reductions in the population of these young neurons have been related to mental health disorders, including depression, which brings us back to the notion of self-perpetuating cycles. And this is where junk food can make us feel pleasure when we're sad, but we eat more, which makes us feel sadder. So cravings are not only due to low dopamine, they can also be due to things like chronic stress, for example. A lot of people don't realize just how much chronic stress influences our behaviors. And in clinic, when I ask the question to everyone, how stressed are you? A lot of women will say, well, I don't really feel like I'm stressed. I'm busy, but I'm doing a lot, but I don't feel stressed. When we dig a little deeper, they're having to kickstart their day off with a lot of coffee, which is a stimulant to get them going. And that, gets them going with adrenaline, and they're pretty much functioning on adrenaline all day. And that is a chronic stress for the body. And so chronic stress can disrupt the gut microbiome, and our gut health can actually dictate the types of foods we crave, because we are more microbes than we are human cells, to the power of 10. Like, it's by a substantial amount. And the more that we have these environmental influences, like a poor diet, like taking medications, like having a lot of stress and not sleeping well, we tend to get a disruption in the health of our microbiome. And so that can also contribute to cravings. That our microbiome itself can be creating cravings for the foods that it needs to sustain it. Insulin resistance and diabetes, and this also links into chronic stress, because a lot of people don't realize that just how much stress can influence our blood sugars and our insulin sensitivity or resistance. So insulin is the hormone that helps us regulate our blood sugars. It's essentially or mostly a fat storage hormone. It does do other important things, but once you become insulin resistant, which means over time, after eating numerous carbs throughout the day, which your body's not really designed to do, it's designed to do it occasionally, but it's not designed to do it all day, every day. And some people are more genetically susceptible for that being a real issue. And if you've already done the carbohydrate intolerance quiz that is within the 8-week course or is on the website, you will understand whether that is something that affects you. And insulin resistance is also known as carbohydrate intolerance. And so once you have that blood sugar dysregulation, that is also going to stimulate the necessity to crave carbohydrate foods, because your body's going to have to regulate its blood sugars. And so it will spike blood sugars and it will dip in blood sugars, and that's going to make you crave those types of foods. Hormone imbalances is all involved with that as well. Anxiety and mental health can certainly impact cravings. Gut infections, or whether it's parasites or SIBO, which is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and that gut dysbiosis, which I was mentioning before, with the whole microbiome throughout our digestive tract. Dysbiosis, meaning that you have overabundance of the wrong type of microbes, can really affect cravings. Inadequate sleep is really, really key here. That can add to inflammation. It can add to the stress response and blood sugar dysregulation, hormone dysregulation. I don't think people really understand just how impactful inadequate sleep is. We tend to feel like if we don't sleep well, it just makes us tired the next day. It affects us in so many other ways than that. Insufficient nutrients is also a big part of cravings. If you're not feeding your body the right types of nutrients, it's going to keep you wanting to keep eating so that it can get the amount of nutrients that it needs, because so many of them are essential. We must get them through our diets. So then we look at emotional cravings as opposed to the physiological cravings. And so this is really more about, the comfort that the food provides than the nutrient value of the food. So this is certainly tied into the physiological cravings as well. But food can often be used to push down emotions that are difficult to process or talk about. So the powerful question that you need to ask yourself here is, what am I really hungry for? Am I hungry for food, or am I hungry for a need that's being unmet? The other thing I like people to consider is, do you have support? Someone to talk through how to handle difficult emotions. So when we look at behaviours, we talk about that emotional craving, and that is where people experience strong emotions. And this is just so common that I find that people, when we really break down to what's triggering emotional cravings, that they can identify that there was some kind of strong emotions going on, whether they're positive emotions of feeling joy and excitement because something great has happened, or whether they're negative emotions that someone has stressed them, they've had a confrontation, they've been disappointed. Any types of emotions that register as intense can be really difficult to then know what to do with if you haven't learned a positive mechanism that doesn't involve food. So if throughout our childhood, for example, we've been taught to deal with any of those emotions with food, then it's likely that that has become our sole mechanism for dealing with them. And so emotional cravings can lead into emotional eating. And so that's where we're turning to food for that comfort or for avoidance, and eating when not hungry and overeating just for that pure pleasure of eating. So that's that eating addiction, being addicted to the eating behavior itself. And that's also ties in with self-medicating, that we're feeling feelings that we're not enjoying, we don't know how to deal with them, we're medicating to feel better. And so for some people, that may be that they need to be speaking with their health professionals, where there may be a more effective way of medicating that could help so that you're not self-harming through foods that are leading into, or attributing to comorbidities, things like obesity, and then lipolymphedema. Of course, obesity, if it gets to a certain level, which is that lifestyle weight gain, can then in fact aggravate lipedema and cause secondary lymphedema. So we really want to be avoiding that. And if there are other ways to medicate that are appropriate for what you're going through, then that needs to be explored. And then there are behaviors, so binge eating and bulimia, where that disordered eating comes into it. If we're not dealing with that emotional eating over time, for some people that may escalate into disordered eating. So emotional issues that can be masked as a food issue. So some of the common ones do include things like sadness, frustration, boredom. Procrastination is a big one that people, often don't realize just how much they're using food because they're unable to make decisions, or they're unable to know what to do next, or they don't have the support system to help them work through something that they're having an issue with. I know that for myself, that procrastination, when I get to a point where there's a task that needs a little further work, for example, that is time consuming, that can keep me in that procrastination level. And it can be really easy to use food for that. And I know that anyone who has studied at uni level or beyond can certainly understand increasing food through procrastination with doing uni assignments and exams and things like that. Even feelings of worthlessness, loneliness, depression, we know those types of feelings can be largely involved with food because there's no other outlet to deal with those things. And we also know that with lipedema, the more the condition progresses, the more people socially isolate. And it's really important that you address those feelings and find ways to reconnect with people and find support, so that you don't get lost, in those feelings and self-medicate or self-soothe in ways that are worsening your health. So we need to look at stop feeding the feelings and feed the unmet need. What is it that you need? Is it that you need someone to talk to help you set up better coping mechanisms? What tools do you have in your toolbox to help you deal with those strong emotions? So how to change? Well, the first step really is about awareness. So being more aware of your emotions, especially before, during, and after you've eaten. Bringing that mindfulness to your eating so that you can become aware of the feelings. Becoming more aware of the triggers and the willingness to feel positive discomfort. Change can be uncomfortable, but it does lead often to great things. So I think it's important to understand that concept, because if you really do have goals that you'd like to reach, you must have the processes that will take you to those goals. That's the key part that's often missing for a lot of people. Is redefining those processes on what can actually work, keeping in mind that we're dealing with, hormones, the brain, all of these processes that we've just spoken about. What are the processes that can actually make sure that you're implementing things in line with what's happening from, that chemical, hormonal underpinnings? So asking powerful questions. First one is when. When are you triggered and find yourself using food to cope with emotions? And I'd love you to write these down. And there is a worksheet that you can work through to do that. So is there a typical time of the day that you get stressed or overwhelmed or bored, or whatever emotion it is that comes up for you? Is there times, different months or different years? So it could be people's birthdays, it could be Thanksgiving or Christmas. Easter time, it's different for everyone. It could be all of those things. You need to be really clear on when they are, because you're going to need to problem solve, which means planning. You're going to have to plan how you're going to get through those times and do it differently in a way that supports your health goals. So for some people, there's big events. And some people, it's certain people or relationships. So, if there are toxic relationships that you're in that are keeping you feeling stuck, then maybe for an amount of time until you feel stronger and, are well on your new pathway, then, perhaps you need to change the type of people that you're surrounding yourself with that really support your goals. So there's also the what. What is it you're eating, and what about it is appealing? So is it specific foods that are an issue for you? Are there meals or dishes that you're cooking? I know a lot of women that as soon as they start cooking, they're snacking from the moment that starts. That can be part of it as well. Is it drinks or combinations of foods? And what is it that you love about it? And what is it that you feel that it's satisfying? Is it the food that you love, or is it the feeling that it's giving you? And also the why. So why did it trigger you? And this is, really important to have a really good think about, and, really get down to that detail about why is it that particular event or person is causing negative emotions. What's the intense feeling that it's creating for you? And so also, how are you feeling, and how are you talking to yourself before, during, and after you've eaten? Listening to the negative self-talk that's going on and paying attention to that. But also, we encourage you to be curious, not judgmental in all of this process. Don't judge yourself and beat yourself up. We've done that for decades. We've been taught to judge ourselves and beat ourselves up for how we're eating. That's not helpful. We need to just be curious about what's happening so that we can find solutions. This is about being solution focused. So replacing the old coping mechanisms, which was food, with new coping mechanisms. And there are tons of different things you can try out there. And here's just, some examples, but things like emotional freedom technique, or EFT. It's also called tapping, and it's a really powerful tool that you can use when it comes to emotional eating. And it's something that you really, you can do anywhere, anytime. And it's about tapping on different pressure points. There's different ones. And when you watch a video, it's actually really quite simple to do. You repeat a mantra, and it's just about reprogramming that negative talk that's there. And it's also about just keeping calm, because it's obviously quite often it's about, the stress and anxiety that happens when something is triggering us. So something that can actually counterbalance that and keep us grounded is so beneficial. Clinical hypnosis is another great one to help remove some of the belief patterns that might be driving you towards food. So to help learn and recognize what sort of belief patterns are there, what are some of the triggers, so that you can then go about finding and implementing strategies to move forward. And as I mentioned, there's the worksheet there, so please do work through that. It can be really helpful to have it written down and spend some time with that. So some tips for curbing cravings. As I mentioned, embracing positive discomfort. If you want to change can be uncomfortable. And obviously this needs to be within your boundaries. So be clear of your boundaries of discomfort, but we need to get out of our comfort and safety zones to be able to put these processes in place and move forward. So make sure that you have the support network to do that. And so that you can feel like it's okay. I'm feeling a little uncomfortable, but that's okay, because I'm working and moving towards my goal. Satisfy the cravings with quality protein and healthy fats. And this is really what we're all about with low carbohydrate nutrition and keto nutrition, is that we're addressing what's driving hormonal dysregulation. And for women with lipedema, it's particularly important that we address inflammation, and also insulin and blood sugar control. So that's, how we do that with quality nutrition. Also satisfy, or as I mentioned, with the quality protein, but also to improve sleep. As I mentioned, sleep is just such a key factor here. It's not just about the food, it's also about the sleep. And it's also about movement and exercise, and just stress levels. So they're key that you address all of those things and find ways to incorporate it all. And often they all feed into each other. Changing context associations. This is a really big one, because there's normally a place that we will go to eat the foods that we're using for emotional comfort. So whether that's in front of the TV, that every night we sit down after dinner to the TV and that's when the snacks come out, or every time that we're on the phone. So it's doing things like, okay, I'm not going to eat on the couch anymore. I've got to eat at the table. And so, just changing those associations with food can be really helpful as well. Eating over the sink, a lot of women do that. They're in a hurry, or they're not kind of wanting to actually sit down to food. They're just convincing themselves that this is just a quick snack or a passing thing that they're doing, so they're eating on the run. Changing that so that you're actually sitting down with your food, taking your time, slowly eating. A lot of people I find who have carbohydrate addictions, or just eating a lot of food emotionally, will eat very fast, and they'll typically be the one who finishes their food first at the table. So even things like just slowing down your eating can be really helpful as well. Yeah, lots of tips there. If you would like to discuss that in more detail and you haven't had a consultation with me, feel free to book in for a free strategy session. For those of you doing the 8-week course, you already get your 90-minute initial consultation as part of the course with me. And then we can talk about, perhaps how we can work together moving forward. And there's lots of key issues that we can address, and whether that's digestive discomfort, and as well as just working through some of these issues that we've been speaking about with emotional eating.